Okay, so thank you for joining today. Um, Together with me, Amanda, at Accounting for Nature, I have Chrissy Elmer, our Science and Technology Manager, and she is going to introduce the Landcare native vegetation method. So if you are unfamiliar with the Zoom webinar feature, you might have noticed that you can't unmute yourself or turn on the camera. Instead, we have a little Q&A box down at the bottom. So as Chrissy is talking today, feel free to pop any questions into the Q&A chat box. If they relate to Accounting for Nature, I will go ahead and type answers as Chrissy is speaking. But if they're relating to the method in question, we will collect all of your questions till the end, and then we'll go through and answer them after that. So if you are here today and you're unfamiliar with Accounting for Nature, it is an environmental condition accounting framework that allows you to measure and report and verify the environmental condition of a project, property, or a region. And so the method Chrissy will be talking about today is a method suitable for the project or the property scale. We run monthly introduction webinars. So if you want to learn more about Accounting for Nature, I will shortly pop a link into the chat where you can find upcoming introduction webinars to the Accounting for Nature framework. With that being said, I'm going to hand over to Chrissy Elmer to go through the method.
Thanks, Amanda. I'll just bring up my share screen. Awesome, fantastic. Okay, so I'll start with a little bit of background about me. So I'm a terrestrial plant ecologist. So I studied plant science and ecology at university, and then I gained some diverse experience. So I was a lab manager and research assistant at a plant ecology lab. I've worked as an environmental officer for local government, and then I also have experience in environmental consulting, so conducting a lot of ecological assessments. So I've been with Accounting for Nature for about 2.5 years now, and as Amanda said, I'm the Science and Technology Program Manager. So that means that I really help people develop and implement the methods, but we're also developing an online tech platform to help make the whole environmental accounting process a lot easier. So a little bit of background about this method. So in 2021, we actually kicked off a big project with Landcare Australia Landcare farming, to teach farmers about environmental condition accounting. So we actually conducted a series of workshops across Australia, teaching farmers and various Landcare groups about Accounting for Nature, about environmental condition accounting, and also how to actually do it and implement methods in the field. And so to support that project, we developed this method. So this method, this method was designed to provide farmers with a really scientifically sound and rigorous way of consistently measuring, reporting, and verifying changes in vegetation condition over time. So the idea being that this method could be used to generate data that is easily understood and be able to be incorporated into decision making. It would be able to support investment in the environment, but then also more broadly, just be able to help farmers better understand their land and therefore better understand their management practices. And so this method was designed to be accessible and user-friendly. So it does employ quite rapid and simple assessment techniques and doesn't require too much specific expertise in ecology. So broadly speaking, it requires people to be able to identify species that are native to their specific area, and then be able to do some structural and functional sort of assessments of the vegetation. So this method is designed to be able to be applied Australia-wide, and as Amanda said, at the project or property scale. And the method has also been designed to be 80% accurate. So that means that it's quite easy to implement. However, it can't be used to support things such as unitization. So under the Accounting for Nature framework, we have 3 different levels of accuracy, the top one being 95% accurate and the lower level being 80% accurate. And so we see this method really being used to inform decision making and also to just gain a better understanding of the environment and as a sort of stepping stone into environmental accounting and measuring the environment. And so as central to all accounting for nature methods, this method develops an Econd metric. And so this metric summarizes the environmental condition of native vegetation, in this case, on a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 represents the reference state or the undergraded state or the best possible state of that particular vegetation type. And 0 would represent that the vegetation is completely degraded. So think a concrete slab. And so this metric is really useful because it summarizes all of that complex scientific information into a single score, which means that it's easily understood by a diverse range of audiences. So if you're wanting to take this information to your bank, for example, they understand a percent score of condition, as opposed to saying, oh, my canopy height was 30 meters. My canopy cover was 10%. Like, that doesn't mean much in the broad context of things. So by able to be summarizing condition as a percent, it's a lot more accessible to a lot more people. The Econd also allows you to compare the condition of environmental assets. And so you'll see as we walk through the example that you actually get various Econd scores, and you're able to then aggregate up and aggregate down. So you're able to compare the condition within a property, but then also between properties, and also between assets, because they're all on that consistent scale of 0 to 100. And so the method implements 7 steps to generate your final Econd score. So we'll walk through each of these steps in detail. So the first step is to define your purpose, scope, and accounting area. So when defining the purpose of your environmental account, we really encourage you to think about why you're developing an environmental account and why is this method appropriate for that purpose. So what sort of decisions do you want to inform, and will this method be able to underpin those decisions? You then need to think about who your intended target audience is for your environmental account. So in some cases, people might want to use it internally for their own understanding. They might want to share it with their bank, for example. They might want to use it for a diverse number of reasons. But it's important to really think these reasons through, and then how those target audiences will be wanting to use or interpret that information. Next, you need to define your scope. And so this method is appropriate for measuring the environmental condition over time. So it's really important to identify changes in condition. And then finally, as part of the first step, you need to define your accounting area. So deciding where you actually want to define the boundaries of the environmental account. So that could cover your entire property. It could cover a group of properties, which is what we would call an aggregate scale, or it would cover part of a property. And that's what we would call a project scale. So for example, if you had a particular regeneration project and you just wanted to monitor the condition of that over time, then that would be a project scale account. And so if you've ever seen the method document, every step in the document does contain an output. And so this is a really good sort of checklist to make sure you've completed the required components of that step. And then also a lot of this information will be required at the end as part of the certification process. And so the outputs of step 1 will be a description of the accounting area, including the location and the size, and this will often be a map. A table describing the purpose and the scope of the account, and then, a map showing the accounting area. Step 2 of this method is where you compile your data, you identify your sub-assets, and you identify your land uses. So the method includes a number of resources that are required to complete the environmental account. But broadly speaking, at this point, we really are relying on current remnant and regrowth vegetation mapping, pre-clear historic vegetation mapping, and reference benchmark data. And so once we have collected that data, we can use that to interpret our sub-assets. So in this method, our sub-assets are defined as our different vegetation communities. So think about in Queensland, we've got regional ecosystems. In Victoria, we have EVCs. In New South Wales, we have plant community types. So the method includes example tables of all of these different levels of data. And so the sub-assets are defined as the pre-clear vegetation communities that exist within your accounting area. And then finally, we have our land uses. So this is really sort of a farm management map where you can identify different land uses or broad condition states that exist within your accounting area. So broadly speaking, this would be delineating the accounting area into areas such as cropping, grazing, forestry, remnant vegetation areas or projects, retained regrowth vegetation, and any sort of regeneration or restoration areas. These are just examples. We don't provide a sort of structured list of land use types. It's up to the proponent on how detailed they want to be when defining their different land uses or broad condition states. And so the outputs of step 2 will be a map and a table of the pre-clear vegetation types. So remember, that's our sub-assets and the descriptions for each of those for the accounting area, and a map of the land use or broad condition states within the accounting area. And so this table is just an example of the different classifications that exist within Australia within each of the states, and then also the name of the reference benchmark databases if they exist for each of the states. And again, this is published in the method as an appendix. Step 3 of the method is then where you actually start stratifying your accounting area into what we call assessment units. And then we identify our sample sites within each of those assessment units. And so assessment units are broadly described as homogeneous areas from where you take your sample sites from. And so they are then aggregated to give an overall Econd score for each assessment unit. So developing assessment units is a bit of a spatial task. So you generally do need some experience in mapping software such as GIS. But that being said, Accounting for Nature is developing an online platform that can assist with this. So providing an online mapping tool to provide assistance in actually determining these maps. And so as I mentioned before, this map is showing the sub-assets. So this is an example property in Queensland. So it's using the regional ecosystems. And this was developed using the pre-clear regional ecosystem classification. Next, we have independently generated a map of the land uses within this property. So you'll see that we have a large area of grazing, we've got a large area of protected woodland, we've got some little poultry farms, and then also some areas of woodland restoration. So to generate our assessment units, we actually combine these two maps to get the unique combination of the sub-asset and the land use. And so this generates our assessment units. So you'll see here that we end up with the unique combination of the vegetation type and the land use type. And that ends up with 7 different assessment units. So once we've generated our assessment unit map, we then need to identify how many sample sites are required within each assessment unit. And so this method in particular dictates for each assessment unit, you need to have 1 sample site per 5 hectares, but up to a maximum of 5 per assessment unit. And the decision behind that was that this method isn't really designed to be applied at super large scales. And so to keep costs down, we max out the sample sites at 5. However, a proponent is more than welcome to establish more sample sites as they see fit. The method then goes on to detail that sample sites should not be located near edges. And so edges are broadly defined as sort of a change in, well, we'd say an edge between the assessment units would definitely be an edge. An edge could be a fence, an edge could be a road or a lake. So you want to be sort of located in a relatively homogeneous area. The method then dictates that sites must be sampled in a consistent season. So if you sample in spring one year, then you will want to continue all of your sampling repeats in spring in subsequent years. And then finally, your sample sites should be chosen as representative sites of that assessment unit. And so again, that's a bit of a subjective assessment in determining a representative site. And the method also says that representative sites can be located within 250 meters of an access track. So for those slightly larger properties that take a lot of time to get around, this sort of increases the accessibility and implementation of the method. And so using our example on the left, which is around 2,000 hectares, we end up with requiring about 33 sample sites. So as you'll see, a lot of these assessment units are greater than 25 hectares. So they're all maxing out at that 5 assessment unit number. However, we do have one slightly smaller assessment unit that only requires 3 sample sites. So once you've defined your sub-assets and your assessment units, you can then start filling out the template that goes along with this method. So we'll work through the rest of this table as we go through the presentation, but after step 3, you should have been able to fill out the first 2 columns. So identifying your sub-asset or vegetation types and identifying your assessment units. And again, the output of step 3 would be a map and a table of your assessment units, along with a table describing how many sample sites are required within each assessment unit. And step 4 is where you need to sort of understand your indicators, what's required to measure each of those indicators, and then finally determine your reference benchmark values for each of those indicators for each vegetation type. So this method requires a number of different indicators. The first indicator is site context, which is measured with GIS. And so site context is a measure of connectivity within the landscape. So when we enter the data collection stage, I'll walk you through how that's actually measured. Our next indicators can be measured by photos or in the field. And so these indicators are generally our ground cover indicators. So we've got organic litter ground cover and native perennial grass cover, but then we've also got non-native plant cover within the entire vegetation site. Our next indicators are then canopy height and sub-canopy height, canopy cover percent, sub-canopy cover percent, and native shrub cover percent. And these are, again, we'll walk through how each of these are measured in a later section. And so once you've understood your indicators, you then actually need to determine your reference benchmark for each of those indicators for each vegetation type. And so the method goes into detail on how to define these, but broadly speaking, the site context is always assumed to be 100%. And that's mostly around because pre-clearing, we would assume there to be 100% cover of native remnant vegetation. For all of the other indicators, the method says that we would want to sort of draw the values based on the state condition frameworks. So again, in Queensland, that would be like the BioCondition benchmarks. In Victoria, we've got the habitat hectares benchmarks. However, we do know that benchmarks aren't published for every ecosystem across all of Australia. And so where that data isn't available, there are also some other options to establish your own values. So one of these options is establishing local best on offer reference sites. So that would be finding an area that would be the best possible condition of that vegetation type and measuring it at the same time as measuring your account. And then if it's not possible to set up local reference sites for a number of reasons, this could occur because of limited access to potential local reference sites, the fact that they might not exist within an area, then you can also supplement your reference benchmark data with expert opinion. So in Queensland, a lot of proponents are contacting the Herbarium to ask for their help in establishing reference benchmarks. And that is a very suitable option of using expert opinion to determine reference benchmark values. And so again, the output of step 4 is establishing a table with your reference benchmark values for each indicator. So as you'll see here, we've now filled out column 3 and column 4 of our template. So we've listed all of our indicators that will be measured within each assessment unit. And for each of those indicators, we've filled in the reference benchmark value. And I'll just emphasize here that the reference benchmark values are linked to indicators and also the sub-asset type. So you'll see that for both of the assessment units within this first sub-asset, the reference benchmarks are actually the same, and that's because they are the same vegetation community. But when we go down to a different vegetation community, we have different reference benchmark values. And so once you've completed step 4, this is where we would generally recommend that you register your environmental account with Accounting for Nature. And so this is an important step as part of Accounting for Nature's 5-step process, in that it acts as a sort of checkpoint where Accounting for Nature will review what you're proposing to do, make sure that it looks correct, and that it is appropriate for your defined purpose of developing an environmental account. So once your environmental account has been registered, we basically give you the tick of approval to go out and start collecting your data. And so the method dictates how to collect your data. So you'll see the figure on the left shows the general site setup and how and where each of those indicators are measured. But before we get into that, the method does also list the required equipment to implement the monitoring process. So to set up a site, you will need 2 1.8 metre star pickets, 2 0.6 metre star pickets, some labelling tags for your star pickets, a tape measure, so ideally at least 10 metres, but obviously you could have a longer one if required or if available. You need a compass and then also a camera. And so a camera is really important here. So the way we set up our site is that we install our 2 1.8 metre star pickets 10 metres apart. So these are our big yellow circles. We then install our shorter star pickets 1 metre inwards. So these are the little yellow diamonds, 1 metre inwards from each of our large star pickets. And so that's our sample site setup. And the rest of the detail on this figure is around how to actually collect the data. So we'll start off with our photos. So this method relies quite heavily on photos for a number of reasons. Primarily, they're a really good source of verification to ensure that the data collected looks accurate, so it's part of the certification process. But also, if a landholder or proponent or whoever's collecting the data isn't quite confident in scoring some of the indicators, the photos are there so they can share it with an expert or an ecologist to provide some assistance or clarification on ways to score each of the indicators. And so at each large star picket, you take 3 photos. So the first photo is a canopy photo where you rest your camera on the top of the star picket and take a photo looking directly up. Next, we take a landscape photo. So again, resting the camera on the top of the star picket and pointing towards the other star picket. We want to line the top of the opposing star picket up in the center of the frame. And this is really important if you're wanting to show these photos as change over time, that you've got that reference point in the photo. And then finally, we take a ground cover photo, and again, resting your phone on the top of the tall star picket, you point it down towards the small star picket, where you could align either the top of the star picket or the bottom of the star picket in the center of a frame, again, acting as that reference point. And so once you've taken your photos, you then start collecting your data. And so again, in the method, this figure shows exactly where to collect each of your data. And so in our 10-meter quadrat, which is this large gray box, we collect our non-native plant covered data. So generally, when you're implementing this in the field, you could take 5 large steps out and visualize a 10-meter quadrat. So it doesn't have to be an exact 10-meter quadrat. Again, remember, this is an 80% accuracy method designed to be quite a rapid assessment. And so once you visualize your 10-meter quadrat, you then estimate your non-native plant cover. So it's up to you on how you want to do that exactly. You could look at it as a whole, or you could look at each sort of strata within the quadrat to determine the non-native plant cover. Within that area, we then also estimate our canopy height and our sub-canopy height. And the method includes a number of different options on how to measure height of trees. We then will look at our 1 meter quadrats. So we have 2 1 meter quadrats at each of the star pickets. So within each of these, we estimate our ground covers. So we've got our native perennial grass cover and our organic litter cover indicators. And so the average of these two is taken as the value for the site. And then finally, we have our 30-meter step count, in which we measure our canopy cover, our sub-canopy cover, and our shrub cover. And I have a slide on how that actually works in a second. So this is just an example of each of those photos taken as part of the method. So as I said, the canopy photo is looking straight up from the top of the star picket. We've got our landscape photo, and you can just see the opposing star picket in the center of the frame there. And then our example ground cover photo, where we're looking down at that small star picket directly opposite the large star picket. And then just to explain that 30-meter step count, this is really designed as a rapid assessment of the woody cover indicators within the method. If we were doing a 95% accuracy method, for example, we'd generally use a full 100-meter transect and measure down to the centimeter the different covers. So you'll see that this is a much more practical approach to measuring cover. And so basically, you take a step, and if you're under a canopy, you tick that step. And so you keep taking steps until you reach another different strata. And so at step 7, for example, you would be under a canopy and over a shrub. So you would tick both of them. You then complete all 30 steps, and then you're able to sum up the amount of times you are under a canopy or a sub-canopy or over a shrub, divide that by 30, and that's your indicative canopy, sub-canopy, or shrub cover scores. And then once you've collected all your field data, or even before collecting your field data, you have to measure your site context. And so again, this is a spatial exercise typically done in GIS. And so the site context is measured as the percent of retained remnant vegetation within a 1 kilometer radius of each sample site. So you'll see that this is visualized below. We have our sample site in the middle, which you'll see is just on the edge of a little patch here. And then we bring out a buffer of 1 kilometer. And so you'll see this brown area is cleared, whereas the green areas are remnant vegetation. And so the proportion of retained remnant vegetation is 15% in this figure on the left. Whereas at the bottom, we've got a whole lot more retained remnant vegetation within this buffer. And so that's a 67% score. And so for each assessment, for each sample site, you will do this. And so for step 5, you then want to calculate your average measure across your sites within each of your assessment units. So say, for example, we had 5 sites within this first assessment unit. We would average each of our indicator scores, indicator measures, and fill out this column of the template. And so the outputs for step 5 would generally be a folder containing all of the photos you've taken, a data table which contains all of the raw data for each of your sites, and then also the template table that you're filling out for your environmental account. So once you've collected all your data, you are now able to start scoring your account. So the first step is calculating what we call an indicator condition score. And so this is where the reference benchmark values start coming into play, in that we start comparing what those measured values were to the expected values filled out in that reference benchmark column. And so the way this is done is by standardizing the score on a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 will represent that reference benchmark value. And so this method in particular, this is how these relationships look. And so you'll see on the x-axis that we've got the measured value as a percent of the benchmark value, and then the corresponding indicator condition score. So you'll see that if we had only 50% of the canopy height that was expected, so say our reference benchmark for a canopy was 20 meters, but we only measured 10 meters, then we would only be getting an indicator condition score of 50. And so that's generally how the indicator condition scoring works. Some indicators max out at an indicator condition score of 100, whereas other indicators do tend to penalize for overabundance of a particular indicator. So for example, you'll see that a lot of these cover indicators do go down if there is too much. And in particular, that is to just do with overabundance and thickening of vegetation communities that are often disturbed. And so basically our Excel template includes all of those formulas for you. So you thankfully don't have to go and look at those figures and manually score each of them. There are quite complex Excel formulas built into the template that will convert your scores into an indicator condition score. So you end up with a score from 0 to 100 for every indicator for every assessment unit. And so you'll notice here that there are a few not applicables. And that's because this bottom assessment unit is actually a grassland. And so we do have some naturally missing indicators. So obviously in a grassland, you wouldn't expect to see a canopy. So those are given not applicable scores and they don't contribute to the final score. And so what we've done here, you'll see that there is the configuration indicator for all of the assessment units. But then we've got what we call composition indicators. So these are those indicators that you've measured in the field. And all of those indicator condition scores for composition are averaged to give the assessment unit composition score. And so the output of step 6 is essentially this column in the template. And then finally, to calculate your final econ score, we first calculate our assessment unit econs. And so for each assessment unit, what is done is that the configuration indicator condition score is combined with the composition indicator condition score to calculate the assessment unit econ. And each of those are weighted slightly differently. And so as you'll see, there are a whole lot more composition indicators. And so this is weighted 75%, whereas the configuration indicator is weighted only 25%, contributing to that assessment unit econ. Then to calculate the sub-asset econ, we aggregate the two assessment unit econs using the area weighted averages. So for example, this assessment unit might be take up 80% of this vegetation community, and this one might take up 20% of that vegetation community. And so as a result, this would contribute 80% to this sub-asset econ score. And then to calculate the final overall econs, the same concept is applied using area weighted averages. So again, looking at how much area this vegetation type takes up of the total accounting area. And then that is what contributes to the final score. And so the output of step 7, again, would be this completed data table. And just emphasizing again that this is available as an Excel spreadsheet. So if you are wanting to have a go at implementing this, you can reach out to us and we'll send that template through for you to play around with. We do also require a summary table, and that's just summarizing this information. So generally it's just showing the econ scores, not including the indicator condition scores. So once you've built your account, you are eligible to submit your account for certification by Accounting for Nature. And so if you are choosing to have your account certified, you will need to produce what we call an information statement. And so this is basically a technical report that walks through exactly what you did. It explains all of your data sources and references, It interprets your results and discusses your results. And it's really important that this document is actually publicly available because it provides all the transparency around your environmental account. And if you're making any claims about your environmental account, people can go back and read that information statement as a source of truth. As part of certification, you then also need to submit your environmental account, including your raw data, but also just noting that this isn't made publicly available. This is stored securely by Accounting for Nature. In addition to the above, you also will need an audit report or a self-verification report. And so this is part of basically checking that the way you collected data complies with the way defined in the method. And so you have the choice of either using a third-party auditor to conduct that audit, or Accounting for Nature also have a self-verification option where you complete the audit checklist, and then Accounting for Nature verifies that through a technical assessment. And so the second option is quite a bit cheaper than the first option. As part of certification as well, we would generally also require various supporting documentation, and most of the time that will be the outputs from each of those steps. So once your account has been certified, it will be listed in the Accounting for Nature Environmental Account Registry. And as I said before, this is an important source of truth for anyone who is reading a claim about an environmental account to be able to trace it back and actually read what was done and what the results were for themselves. And so the Environmental Account Registry shows a summary of the environmental account, what assets it included, what the Econd score was, what confidence levels were used, and also if there's been any trend over time. It also shows balance sheet, It also shows a balance sheet, which is similar to financial balance sheets. We maintain our environmental account. So, So we repeat sampling at least once every 5 years, but it can be more frequent. We also require you to return to the same sampling sites, so the same star pickets. As mentioned before, sites should be returned to in the same season. And then also data collection should ideally be completed by the same person to reduce any sort of variability. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. We are going to open up for Q&A. So if you navigate to the bottom of your panel, you'll see this little Q&A box. So any questions you have about either the method that Chrissy just presented or about Accounting for Nature, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A. We did receive a question by Yolanda, and this was probably before you actually went through the field sampling, Chrissy, but I thought we might as well just go through and cover it again in case there was any uncertainty. So Yolanda's asking, with each area measured, how much do you look at, for example, ground cover quadrants?
Thanks, Yolanda. Yeah, so as you would have seen, the site setup includes 2 1-meter quadrats.
Unfortunate, Chrissy, you swallowed some air or some water in the wrong throat.
Tickle in my throat.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the method design includes 2 1-meter quadrats where native perennial grass cover and litter cover are measured in those 2 1-meter quadrats for each sample site.
Thank you. So there's no other questions in the Q&A box at the moment. I'm going to wait a minute before we end the session, just in case someone is still typing. I think maybe you were just really clear going through the method question and didn't leave a lot of questions to be asked about it, Chrissy. I might take a moment as well to say that we do have an upcoming webinar for one of the more popular fauna methods as well. So we'll be joined by Matt Taylor, who wrote a method for how you can track and monitor fauna using cameras. So if you're interested in that, go to the chat and there's a link to upcoming webinars where you can register for that session. So Catherine has a question. She is asking, firstly saying thank you for the great presentation, and is asking if there's a manual for the process.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so all accounting for nature methods are actually published on the website. And so if you navigate to the website, there'll be a method option at the top. You'll click on that, and then there'll be an option to view the native vegetation methods. And within there, it will be the method ID NV-06. And so that provides all the detail around what I just talked about. So it is essentially the manual for the process. And then, as I mentioned as well, there is an Excel spreadsheet that you can request from us that we can send through.
Thank you, Chrissy. And Catherine, I might mention that in the chat, I posted a link directly to the native vegetation methods. So if you want to use that link, it's a bit of a shortcut to actually find the method. We also have an online training course that you can access through our website. So that takes you through the full process of developing an environmental account, and actually uses this particular Landcare method as the example running through the course. So you'll be developing a kind of mock environmental account using this specific method. It's a really good introduction, not just to environmental accounting, but also prerequisite if you want to lead the environmental account process yourself. Doesn't look like there are any more questions. So in case there's something you're wondering down the line, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Send it through to either info@accountingfornature.org, or you can also send questions to methods@accountingfornature.org if it's a method related question. In case you missed any part of the webinar, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly as well. And we also have saved method webinar recordings from other method webinars we've held in the past. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for joining me and Chrissy today, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon and rest of the week.
Everyone.